All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this official training for KL 025.5. This is for Kaspersky Anti-Targeted Attack Platform 5.0 and EDR Expert. Right, so this is for the on-premises deployment, but we also do have the cloud-based deployment that's available. Do not worry if you're not sure exactly how the difference looks like. Don't worry, we will talk about that throughout this entire training. So ladies and gentlemen, this particular technical training is an official training with a very small audience, and it's designed for that purpose. This gives you more freedom to be able to ask as much questions you need, and also gives me enough time to be able to respond in a more comprehensive way to whomever is attending this particular session. Now, for those of you, I do see there is a couple of the names that I've met in the past and I've dealt with in the past, but for those of you that don't know me, my name is Brandon Miller, and I am a channel pre-sales engineer and senior technical consultant with Kaspersky, serving the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa region. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is a full-fledged technical training. It is designed to be for technical and pre-sales resources. It is not designed to be for sales individuals or non-technical staff. So for this particular training, we will be covering a combination of two products that work hand in hand together, namely KATA and EDR Expert. With that being said, we are going to primarily focus on an on-premises based deployment purely because KATA itself, Kaspersky Anti-Targeted Attack, is only on-premise at this point in time. Our EDR products do have the option of running in the cloud, but for KATA, due to its nature of activity, it is unfortunately not able to run in the cloud. Nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, for this particular technical training, it involves a hands-on part of the training as well. Now, hands-on basically means that you will be opportunity to deploy the solution, configure the solution, work with the solution, test it out in a secured setting, right? It's a segregated, secured setting, which gives you that capability of gaining additional experience on the product, getting a better understanding of how everything fits together, how everything is being done. This particular session for our partners, we obviously also have the recordings that are available, and these are to be used by the partners. But generally speaking, these need to come with a request. All right. But generally speaking, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining this particular session. As I said, this is an official technical training, and we are going to talk about these two particular products throughout this training. This training in question is a 3-day technical course. This means 3 full days. It means that I'm not going to be talking for 3 full days. Trust me, you and I will get tired of that. But rather it's going to be 3 days. Usually in the mornings we will do the presentation, and then in the afternoons we will go over to the hands-on part where you yourself will actually configure, deploy, and work with the solution. At this stage of the conversation, we have yet to share any documentation with you. We are going to share all of the documentation to you later in the afternoon once it becomes necessary. What I do want to ask you is to please pay very special attention to the presentation part, because this is me conveying some insight and knowledge to you, and this is what we would consider the primary activity, right? So with that being said, obviously we do have the labs as well, and we do have breaks in between as well. So usually we take 1 hour lunch break in the afternoons, to just break up the presentation part and the hands-on training part. And the hands-on training part is usually going to take place with a of Kaspersky education resources, as well as perhaps even AWS, right? So it's important to understand that this is what we will be working towards, just to give you the full agenda, we've got 3 full days of technical training. For day 1, we've got a total of about 130 slides, and then the rest will be broken up into second day and third day. But the first day is probably the most intensive. And this is because we need to explain the solution to you, give you some insight. We'll talk about deployments and these kinds of activities, and then we'll go into the very interesting stuff, usually by the end of today and the beginning of tomorrow, and that will continue through to the end of the session itself. Right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's very important for me to note that the current version that the solution is on as we speak does not reflect the version that we are going to be training on. So the current version that's available is KATA version 5.1, not KATA 5.0. Now, with that comes some minute changes that I will talk to you about, which is fundamental in your understanding, right? So with that being said, that is your forewarning, and I will mention this a few times as we progress. For all attendees in this particular session, you are eligible to receive your attendance certificate of this training, and that attendance certificate, if you have completed all 3 days, will be your certificate or your voucher to do the official technical training and get the official exam done for this particular product. Right, so that's the primary premise or intro I would like to give to you. Now, just to finish that off, we'll talk about the platform we are using. We are using GoToWebinar. If you're unfamiliar with the GoToWebinar, you'll notice that you are muted from the get-go, and this is just to ensure that I have priority over speaking. But we do encourage you to please ask as many questions as possible. If you've got any concerns, if you would like for me to redo a certain section, you can let me know, right? You can do so either via the chat, but I personally prefer the questions section in GoToWebinar. And if you would like to rather have a conversation, you can use the raise hand functionality of GoToWebinar. I will see your raised hand. I will finish up with whatever section I'm busy with at that time. I will announce your name. You will then need to unmute yourself, but I will also unmute you from my side, from an administrator side, and then we can have a brief conversation around your question. All right, ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you so very much for joining, and this is the point where we get started. Thank you. So, as for this particular training, we are going to be talking about Kaspersky Anti-Targeted Attack 5.0, and we'll also be talking about Endpoint Detection and Response 5.0. Now, with that being said, we're also going to have some level of integration discussions surrounding endpoint security for business from Kaspersky. Now, each one of them has their own set of unique capabilities and purposes, so please stay tuned so that we can emphasize what is the differences. Right, ladies and gentlemen, so first and foremost, before we can get into the solution itself, let's first talk about why it is necessary to have a solution such as this, right? And that is with the discussion of the threat landscape. Now, the threat landscape itself has been exponentially growing slowly but steadily, you know, and we're looking at a cybercrime cost that is predicted to hit about $8 trillion in 2023, right? And as you can see, by 2025, it's going to increase even further. So there's so many different examples, right, of some targeted attacks or some espionage or some nation state activities or some specific organizations being targeted and being you know, taken down. And this is all due to cyber attacks, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when we talk about these kinds of cyber attacks, what is the difference between that and just conventional? The simplest explanation that I can give you is that malware is singular files that is designed to do one thing and one thing only, right? It is designed to work in a certain setting, and that's about it. It doesn't have the capacity to change, doesn't have the capacity to, you know, adapt, if you will, because it's a set and forget kind of scenario in most cases, at least. Obviously, this is not the truth for all attacks in the organization, But what we would like to focus on is APTs, or Advanced Persistent Threats. Now, an advanced persistent threat has some human element linked to it. Usually, an advanced persistent threat is highly targeted, stealthy, evasive, complex, and persistent. Now, when you combine those three different areas, it becomes quite a scary kind of narrative for any organization, regardless of their size. Now, the majority share of smaller organizations will not even recognize or understand that they are currently being targeted with a cyber attack. But for your larger organizations, they typically have the right technologies in place to be able to realize this, right? And this solutions that we will be talking about is playing a key part in this discussion. Now, the targets for APT attacks is wide and varied, but typically the main objectives is always to do with money, finances, right? That's one of the primary objectives, but that's not the only one. You've got intellectual property, you've got confidential information, personal information, access to data and information systems, right? This goes directly into espionage and then subsequently into sabotage, right? So you've got large organizations that's being targeted to influence or manipulate the stock market, for example. You have one government attacking another government. You have so many different examples of possible attack that it's impossible for me to share in a single sitting, right? Now, an example of an APT attack can look anywhere as, simple or basic as a normal attack if you put it on a two-dimensional screen like this. But it's important for me to mention to you that an APT attack is far from two-dimensional. It's far from just linear. It's far from just A, B, C, D. There is a lot of reiteration of attacks. There's a lot of reiteration of actions. There is a lot of research that goes into this using open source intelligence, or OSINT, right? And then you've got things like initial breaches or initial infections. That's typically done with phishing attacks or phishing emails. We're just using this as an example because this is the number one method of breach, but there's so many different other ones as well. Now, with an initial infection, you've got additional malware that's going to be added. You've got attack development, and you've got discovery from an attacker's perspective to understand your infrastructure and data sets much better. Understand the environment, the lay of the land, if you will, right? And with that being said, you can even have things like data theft that's taking place, and that's being sent to a command and control server, or also known as a CNC server, right? Another example of an APT attack is something like using vulnerabilities found in operating systems and software as a whole, right? So here we can see the log4shell vulnerability or exploit that's being used on a vulnerable VMware Horizon server, right? So there's a combination of different methods that can be used, and quite frankly, from a defending perspective, it's a needle in a haystack scenario. And this is going to become even more difficult if you don't have the right solutions in place to help you to make that needle in a haystack a needle in a stack of needles, right? Having the right technology is fundamental and key. But technology is only one part of the discussion. As you know, obviously you've got processes and procedures that's necessary. You've got people and skills that's necessary. So a combination of all of this put together is going to really give you the best, let's say, fortitude against these kinds of attacks, right? Now, that is talking directly to the challenges in building an information security system. The challenges that we can face when building an information security system is wide and varied, and this is presented to you by a multitude of different vendors, multitude of different researchers, right? So some of the problems is that 43% argue that the attack surface is spiraling out of control, and we can only see the final steps of an attack, right? So that's one aspect to take into account. There is no clear plan of action, right? And if you look at the United States, about 50% of these small businesses only 50% of small businesses have a cybersecurity plan in place. That goes beyond the conceivable point one and point two and actually thinks about strategy. Then you also need to understand the lack of resources. So the lack of resources comes into the format of humans, people, workers, the workforce, right? The lack of resources, if we look at it at this point in time, cybersecurity expertise is not something that you can just go in and quickly go and get in a university or in a diploma. It takes years of experience. It takes understanding of a multitude of different technologies, languages, and of course, the overall bigger picture before you can implement your understanding and your know-how into how to protect the entire industry. So this is why it is, well, partially at least, why I consider it to be a lack of resources at this point in time. You do not have enough people that has the necessary amount of experience that's shifting over into the cybersecurity field. And if you have those cybersecurity individuals, it becomes a really hard task to retain them, keep them up to speed, because they've got so many different opportunities to move from one organization to the next, from that organization to the next, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a very difficult task to retain the capability, right? And then you also laying back into the point that I mentioned earlier, the lack of understanding of what to protect, right? Like I said, cybersecurity, as I view it, in my personal opinion, and this is obviously just my own opinion, is not something that you can just go directly into. It's the same with doctors, right? A doctor cannot become a neurosurgeon without understanding the entire body first. They need to understand the entire body first before they can specialize into something like the heart or your brain or something like that, right? Now it's the same thing, but just in the concept of cybersecurity. So cybersecurity, you first need to understand the broader scope, understand networks, understand software, understand hardware, understand the entire business, understand projects and these kinds of things before you can really adequately move into cybersecurity. So this is where this point points to the lack of understanding of what to protect. Because that individual, if they do not have that necessary experience, for example, they would not know what else to think about, what else to protect, what is all of the avenues of entrance from a cyber criminal, right? So these are all just things pointing to a problem that we need to deal with. And the purpose of me telling you about all of these different problems is to try and simplify and provide the right technology to automate a lot of the heavy lifting that your lack of resources might be dealing with, or lack of expertise might be dealing with, right? Now, if we talk about the approaches of building an information security system, it boils down to three different areas. So people, processes, and technologies. Now, this is the same thing if you look at a security operations center. It's the same three different things: people, processes, and technologies, right? So within Kaspersky, obviously, we have the capability to do SOC audits and provide guidance on how to set up a security operations center. But these are three of the primary aspects that is necessary: having the right people, the right skilled individuals in the right locations, having the right processes and procedures in place to be able to understand what is my next step if something bad should happen. And finally, the technologies which act as your basis point, your foundation, your automation. That is where the bulk of data is going to come through, is your technology. So you need to have the right ones in there. So that brings us to the kill chain itself. Now, the kill chain can be put in a linear kind of discussion, such as this one. This is a highly, highly simplified version of the kill chain. I want to be absolutely clear about this. But just in the context of this discussion, you've got pre-compromise, which means that's usually something that you can't really do much about because this is purely reconnaissance and weaponization, right? Meaning I'm trying to figure out what's going on in your environment and I'm building a malware for your environment. But at this point of the discussion, I haven't even touched your environment, right? That brings us to security breach, which is delivery and installation and spreading. This is usually where you start understanding, okay, I'm being attacked with your perimeter defenses. Then you've got command and control. You've got accomplishing of goals, and you've got disappearance, right? The deletion of logs and history. So from a Kaspersky portfolio, no one solution can face all of these areas by itself. You need to have specialized technologies and services that's in place that looks at all of the different areas and that feeds into and feeds from a global standard. And that global standard in this context is going to be the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So this is a combination of a variety of different data sets coming from a multitude of different vendors. And this is going to act as our Bible, if you will, and that's going to help us significantly in understanding what it is that's going on, right? Having some form of a static point to refer to as soon as something becomes unclear, right? Now, the approaches to building an IS system, right, is understanding the corporate business processes and procedures, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're protecting a business. So there's a very fine line between having the utmost levels of security and having the utmost best business strategy and process, right? We need to find that fine line, make sure that we don't go into the one or the other direction, which means that we need to get the fundamentals right. Okay. Now, we need to understand the criticality of your most important assets, your servers, for example, your devices in the workforce. These are just simple examples. Your networking infrastructure, your DCs, right? You need to adopt a security posture relevant to your risk profile. I cannot stress this enough, and I did an interview about this not too long ago. The risk profile of a business is going to be wide and varied depending on where you are located, number one, geographically. Where are you located? Number two, what industry are you focusing in? Number three, what is the procedures and restrictions that is being put in place regarding your vertical? I'm going to use financial industries as a good example. Financial industries have, PCI DSS. You've got so many different rules and regulations that need to be followed because you're dealing with people's money, right? Now, every business everywhere has some level of authoritative body that needs to create a guideline or a framework that says this is something that we need to have in place. This is a prerequisite. This is a requirement. This needs to be there. You dealing with X, Y, and Z, which is critical for A, B, and C. And so we need to deal with those things. So it's important to understand your business's risk profile, right? And you need to adopt and evaluate and reconfigure and implement where necessary, all right? Then you need to build a robust monitoring and response plan. This comes in back to the procedure side of things, right? So overall, the first two, that's easy to understand, but the third one, we need to really implement properly. And this can be brought up into these four different quadrants of discussion: prediction, prevention, response, and detection. So these four different areas is going to help us to implement the right technologies, the services in place to be able to understand threats better, to be able to adapt to the threats that we're seeing on a new front every single day, and having the right technologies and processes in place to be able to defend against it. Now, I want you to look at these four different ones and quickly read through them, because the next slide, what I'm going to show you is how Kaspersky can actually fit into every single one of these four different points, right? So have a quick read, have a look at it, understand it, from a prediction perspective, a prevention perspective, response and detection, right? Now, if we have a look at how Kaspersky can actually fit into these different areas, this is what you will see. From here, you can see which services, your threat intelligence, technology, solutions, and knowledge can be put into those four different areas from a Kaspersky standpoint so that we fulfill all of the requirements, fulfill all of the prerequisites, right? Now, that helps us significantly in understanding why it is necessary to have a kind of technology as advanced and complex as the solution that we will be talking about today, right? So with that being said, I just wanted to make sure that I set the tone at an adequate level before we start talking about the technologies and solutions that will help us in this overall approach, right? So which task can KATA help to solve, right? So basically, who will benefit from KATA? Your management in the reduction of possible damage, risk mitigation, your heads of department in increasing the overall efficiency, making sure that you have an understanding of consequences and opportunity to receive additional resources, preparation of reports for management about detected threats, and of course your engineers, because your engineers will be the ones responsible for solving the tasks with as little time and effort necessary to be able to do those things. They will be able to enhance their skills and understanding to once again add value to the company and to the job market. So generally speaking, when we talk about cybersecurity and we strip away the borders, there's a couple of different solution classes that we will talk about. For example, endpoint protection platforms, which is considered fundamental or foundational in any organization regardless of size, right? These are typically talking directly to networked endpoints. Then you can enhance that even further by providing EDR or endpoint detection and response, which gives us the capacity and the capability to analyze the endpoint activity, look at the very unique activity that's taking place inside of those endpoints, above and beyond what is already being defended by with our endpoint security, right? Then you've got network traffic analysis, going beyond the perimeter of an endpoint and understanding your network much better, understanding the way that communication takes place, either in a north-south or an east-west manner, right? And what I'm referring to is internet-bound connections and internal-bound connections. And then finally, XDR, or extended detection and response. Now, a lot of our competition will say that, okay, we've got XDR, but what they basically provide is EDR functionality with the help of MDR, but it's not full-fledged XDR. What extended detection and response is a combination of endpoints, it's a combination of services, of threat intelligence, of your network. It's understanding all of those and having the ability to integrate all of them in providing you with all of the insight in a single view kind of setting, providing with all of the additions, all of the benefits, all of the, let's say, responses that is applicable in a single solution, not just focusing in on an endpoint. That's not adequate, right? So talking about the KATA platform, how do we work with it, right? What is the approach to building a cybersecurity system, right? So with that being said, we need to study and understand the corporate IT infrastructure and the business processes. As we've discussed, that's that fine line that we need to understand between the business directive and the security. We need to be able to then integrate our KATA platform into that, posture, and obviously understand the system and the processes. And as part of that, we will need to be able to identify the threats, eliminate them, and minimize damage to the organization so that we can adapt our processes, our cybersecurity and IT systems to be able to prevent incidents currently and in the future, right? Because cybersecurity, either if you're on a defense or attacking side, is ever evolving. It is ever evolving. It's not something that you teach once and then it stays the same for years and years to come. No, this is something that changes frequently. And if you're in the session, I'm sure that you understand this as well, right? So ladies and gentlemen, this is my conclusion for the introduction of our 3-day training course. At this point in time, before we progress into the second area here, which is pre-deployment, I would like to extend a question to you. Do you have any questions? Is there anything that you are unsure of? Anything that you would like for me to highlight? Any comments you would like to make before we begin into the actual context of this discussion? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the interesting parts. And that is going to be our components and capabilities. So when we talk about the KATA platform, I want you to understand two things. From the very beginning, I want you to create a box. One box is for your network, right? Inside of that is everything that uses the network um, for its primary purpose, right? This includes things like your general traffic internally from one device to the next. It includes communication with websites. It includes downloading of content. It includes emails coming in and going out. It includes my communication from my endpoint to the rest of the environment as well as to the internet, right? So I want you to create that box with all of those things that I've just mentioned inside of it. Then I want to create another box, and this box is going to be just for your endpoint. Okay, so the endpoint one is going to contain things like your registry entries. It's going to contain things like services. It's like how files and programs and applications operate inside of it, right? So now we've got these two boxes, and to accurately align them according to the products that we have in this particular discussion, the first box, the networking box, is directly related to KATA. Okay, KATA by itself is focusing on the network. EDR by itself will focus on endpoint detection and response, and basically that means our endpoints and how our endpoints work and what is going on inside of those endpoints. So I want you to create that segregation between the two. Now, the first box is what we'll talk about now. That is KATA. Now, KATA, as you can see, which is emphasized here, is a platform. Now, this platform gives us the opportunity to combine both of these areas of expertise and interest into a singularity, right? It's integrated, but it can also be separated. It's important to understand this as a fundamental concept before I get to talk about what is included and what is not included, right? So you've got your two boxes, but as a general kind of platform, both of these boxes can be put together into one large box, and all of their capabilities will be able to be shared. Okay, this is the easiest way that I can explain how the solution works. I can either have two smaller boxes focusing in on their own specialities, or I can have one large box that has everything inside of it. Okay, now with that being said, the KATA platform allows for us then to combine these two boxes together, combine the capabilities together. But at the heart of it, we've got the KATA platform. The KATA platform, in this sense, as you will see moving forward, is the central node. The central node of this platform is a physical or virtualized server that has the capability of doing a variety of different detections. It uses a multitude of different technologies to basically act as your workhorse. This is the central node. As the name suggests, this is central to the entire communication scheme. This is where all of the magic happens, right? So as part of the platform, you've got IDS detection, URL reputation, anti-malware engines, mobile attack analyzers, file reputation. You've got the sandbox, which we'll elaborate on a little bit later on. You've got Yara engines, you've got the targeted attack analyzer or indicator of attack detection. You've got thread hunting. So this is also going to be retrospectively, meaning historic data that I can use to thread hunt. I've got interactive responses. So the platform allows us to combine all of this, but the primary aspect of this is what information am I sending to this platform? All right. Now, KATA is going to focus on these areas here. All right. So this is going to be KATA because these are all our network related things. Okay. So you've got mirrored traffic, which is either span, remote span, or RSpan or ER-span. And this is network traffic that's taking place via our central, let's say, switch, our core network switch. Okay, so my communication from my device to your device in the same network, this is all going to be handled by my core network switch. So what we are going to do is we're going to mirror that traffic, right, as the name suggests here, and we will get a duplication or a copy of that data so that we can analyze it and we can assess it and we can respond against it if necessary. Okay, that's one of the primary things that KATA does, is get that information from your core network switch. Then it also has the capacity to integrate into your web proxies, either an existing one, which is a third-party one, or you can, better yet, you can integrate directly into Kaspersky Web Traffic Security, as you will see later on. So if you or your customers have Kaspersky Total Security licenses, you're already licensed to have that web proxy there, right? And this gives us the opportunity to break away the encryption that web traffic will typically have so that we can do proper analysis on it, right? And you have mail traffic as well, and there's obviously a multitude of different protocols to consider here, SMTP, POP3, and so on and so forth. So mail traffic is also going to play a fundamental part, right? Now, the second area of interest, which the platform allows us to do, is to gather insight and information from our endpoints, and this is done by EDR. Okay, Kaspersky EDR. So these are the two boxes that I've been referring to in the beginning, and both of them has their own kind of specific need in the overall discussion of things, right? So it's important to understand that from the get-go. Now, when we talk about the KATA platform, it is derived out of a couple of different data points or sets of information that needs to take place, or services that needs to be provided. So with that being said, as a standard, KATA platform is going to be derived out of your central node, which is marked as number one, because this is the most important thing. Without this, nothing will work, right? Nothing is going to happen, no analysis, no thread capability whatsoever, right? Central node is the most important. The second part to this is the sandbox. That's right. With the licensing options that's available, you also have an opportunity to get an on-premises based dedicated sandbox that will integrate into your central node. It will take information that has already been processed by all of these detection technologies, and if there's still anything unclear, that will be sent into the sandbox. All right. So the sandbox is also a fundamental part to enhance and provide additional detection possibility. Now, the sensor I'm going to mark as point number 3. The reason why is not all organizations will have the necessity of a sensor. All that a sensor is doing is actually communication from whatever ingestion point we have node. So to give you that insight, the sensor can help us to alleviate the abundant load of processing that is required by the central node by taking in data from mail traffic or mail service just by itself, or it can act as a proxy for your EDR agents that is deployed on your endpoints, right? But a KATA sensor and a central node can even go much further than that, as you will see as part of our discussion. But then it's also important to mention to you that this entire setup with 1, 2, and 3 can integrate into a multitude of different other Kaspersky products. such as your web traffic security for proxy, your secure mail gateway for email. You've got your endpoint security as well, which can come into the discussion here, right? All of which is to provide you with a comprehensive solution to be able to discuss, detect, defend a variety of different attack vectors. Now, the central node, and just focusing in on the central node for a little bit here, it receives, as you can imagine, the most amount of communication because it is the central corner piece, if you will, of the entire platform. From here, it is responsible for all activation. It is responsible for all communication with the sandbox. There's no other device, including the sensor, that will directly communicate with the KATA sandbox. It is responsible to do the primary pieces of analysis. So these are all of those detection technologies that we'll elaborate into a little bit later on. It is going to process API files or files via the API. So this is also something we'll talk about soon. And all other pieces communicate with the central node, hence its name. Okay. Now, the central node itself, and it's important for me to note this, the central node can act as a central node as well as a sensor in a single server. But this is usually for POC phases or for very small organizations where they want to save money on hardware, and because they obviously do not require a substantial configuration, it just makes it a lot simpler. But talking about a sensor is going to act as your proxy, as I've mentioned to you. It does do some small detections by itself, for example, IDS and URL reputation, but its primary purpose is traffic passing, and it can act as a proxy for communication, right? So it will primarily act as just your first step in the entire chain of communication that leads all to the central node at the end of the day, right? So with that being said, depending on the integration options that you're going to use, if you're using a third party for proxy, for example, it will not retrieve objects from secure TLS SSL traffic, right? So if you don't use the Kaspersky specifics, or you do not do SSL bumping on the third parties, then in this case, the KATA sensor and the central node will be unable to decrypt encrypted traffic for further analysis, right? Now then, we have the KATA sandbox. Now, the KATA sandbox plays a key role in the overall detection capability of the solution. What it does and what it is, in general, it's a sandbox, which means that it's going to host a multitude of different operating systems, virtual machines, running Windows 10, Windows 7, Windows XP, Astra Linux, CentOS. So that's 5 different operating systems that will be available on the KATA sandbox. In this case, with the standard deployment of the KATA sandbox, I believe you've got the opportunity of spinning up 48 virtual machines running these operating systems, and all of them are dedicated to the purpose of bringing in a file that we suspect to be suspicious and detonating it. What does detonation mean? It means that I'm taking in a file. If it's an executable, I will execute it. If it is a PDF document, I will open it up with a PDF reader. If it is a website, I will visit that website, right? So the sandbox will do so in a segregated, safe space, which means that we can then identify the true nature behind things to understand if it's malicious or not, right? So it will execute or start processes depending on whatever the case may be. And this will happen automatically from the central node that's submitting these files to the KATA sandbox. But the administrator also has the capability of manually specifying files from your EDR agents to basically send it into the sandbox. But it's important to understand that it will never communicate directly. Instead, it will all still communicate via your central node. Okay. So that's a very important thing to realize here. But the purpose of the sandbox is It acts as an additional detection technology that can be used to really fully understand what is going on an infected device, or what is going on with a file that we suspect to be malicious, right? So that we can make a determination and actually act on something like that, right? Now, that brings us to Kaspersky endpoint detection and response. Now, before we can talk about EDR, I want to make sure that you understand that this section that I'm highlighting here, the endpoint agent, I'm scratching this out. The reason why I'm scratching this out is this solution does not require a separate agent to that of your endpoint security. The endpoint security has this agent built in with the latest version, which is version 5.1. All right, so you don't need to have a separate agent that's running to be able to do these kinds of things. It's embedded inside of the endpoint security already. All right, so as part of EDR, endpoint detection and response is designed to provide additional visibility, extended visibility into endpoints and what is going on inside of them, right? It gives you insight on how files interact with one another, how applications interact with the operating system, how the operating system interacts with communication, connections, services, registries, and so on and so forth. And this is all done to understand and defend or detect threats that may be dormant or may be complex in nature that wasn't already detected by your endpoint security. Right. Now, the perfect combination of all of this is taking the platform into consideration. And the platform into consideration means that we're taking all data that's coming from your endpoints, which, by the way, is called telemetry information, taking all of your telemetry information from endpoints, taking all of the information from the network. So taking these two boxes that's typically segregated, putting all of that knowledge together and understanding the behavior and the patterns that's with the combined information to understand if that is a particular attack that is taking place inside of the organization, right? So the KATA EDR expert solution has the capability of understanding the behaviors, because maybe my one single action is not malicious by itself. But if I combine that single action with something that takes place over email, or a web connection that's taking place, or a communication from my device to yours in the internal network, then we consider it to be dangerous, right? So it's necessary to correlate all data in a single platform to fully understand what is going on, right? And don't worry, we'll talk about that in much more detail later on. But then you also have larger organizations. And what do larger organizations have? They've got, typically much larger networks, much larger organizational infrastructure that needs to be defended, and they've got certain prerequisites. Now, with that being said, this entire platform has clustering capabilities. So we've got the clustering options to have in this particular mode, which means that, if one part of the network goes down, the other part will automatically take over. And this is effectively what's going to happen with this platform as well. So with the latest versions, this has been much more enhanced, giving you that capability. Now, some of you may have heard of EDR Optimum. We've been pushing that quite hard for quite some time now. I would say probably the last 2-3 years. And you're probably wondering, we've got a couple of different EDR offerings. So which one suits best for which environment? So let's have a look at the differences. EDR Optimum, which I'll start with on the right-hand side, is designed for anything from a small to medium business, small to medium enterprise, and even an enterprise business. It will all just depend on what exactly it is that you want to accomplish. What is your requirement, right? Obviously, EDR Optimum does not have the network traffic analysis capability that KATA would provide. It just focuses on your endpoint, getting additional telemetry information and providing you with the response activity of that. Right. It also does not provide you with things like threat hunting. Doesn't provide you with things like targeted attack analyzers or indicator of attack, understanding and defense. So EDR Optimum, as you can see, even though it's providing you still with quite a lot of capability, it's not providing you with the capability from a technological perspective equaling that of EDR Expert that would usually be paired with your KATA platform, right? The KATA platform, on the other hand, with the EDR Expert, provides us with much more than just telemetry information, provides us with indicator of attack understanding, provides us with correlation that's taking place with the network. It's taking, the entire response, threat hunting, retrospective analysis to the next level. But equally, the expertise that will be required to fully utilize EDR Expert and KATA is going to be exponential in comparison to that of EDR Optimum. So this is where the very fine line comes in with the difference of solution. You need to understand what is the exact requirement. You need to understand what it is you want to accomplish. And then based off of that information, we can then make the best suggestion to fit a budget, to fit the requirement, and provide you with something that you will actually get value out of in the long run. So to even complicate things a little bit more, Kaspersky EDR Expert has two different iterations. It has an on-premises version and it has a cloud version. Now I'll talk about the on-premises version because you already understand that. Because Kaspersky EDR Expert on-premise is the solution that works with a central node, with the sensors, with the sandbox. It is an on-premises solution that requires a server deployed, which is not that of a Kaspersky Security Center. Whereas Kaspersky EDR Expert, the cloud offering, does not have the ability yet to integrate into KATA, but it also means that it has some enhancements in comparison to that of EDR Optimum. In this case, it brings in indicator of attack scanning, threat hunting, retrospective analysis to the selected period of data, raw data that you've selected as part of the licensing options. But both of these options are equal in its capability, I would say. It's just that if you're using the on-premises version, you obviously have the opportunity of selecting to add KATA into the mix as well, which is the network side. Okay. Now, the deployment schemas and the scaling and the compatibility is going to be wide and varied, and it's important to understand that it's always recommended to talk to the Kaspersky pre-sales or technical support teams to understand what is the requirement. And there is a lot of questions that we are going to ask, and that is purely because we would hate for it, number one, to provide you with an over-exaggerated cost of hardware. Number two, an over-exaggerated cost of licensing. So this is exactly why we ask a lot of questions from a technical perspective. But just to give you some insight, obviously with this particular solution, and we're talking about the on-premises one, central node, the sensor, the sandbox, they do have a massive hardware requirement. And I say massive relatively. In comparison to the Kaspersky Security Center, it's considered massive, but in comparison to our competitors with the same or similar capabilities, it's not massive, if that makes sense, right? But some of the benefits that you will have with an on-premises based scenario is that you can decide how long your retention time should be for raw data. Because you're in charge of your own service, your own hardware, you can then modify. I want to have data storage for 6 months or a year or even longer, depending on how much hardware you want to throw at the server, right? So in this case, the on-premises solution does not have the limitation of only 30 days worth of data or only 60 or 90 days worth of data. You yourself, you are going to be the limitation. How much hardware you put in the server and that you are planning for, right? Now, with that being said, the endpoint security combined with the EDR functionality It's going to have obviously a requirement based on bandwidth, how much network traffic is going to be necessary or how much network bandwidth is necessary to convey the amount of data or telemetry that we're receiving from our endpoints, for example. So this is just a rough estimation just to put it into perspective for you. If you've got, 1,000 devices, at least if you have, all of these separated across the country or across the globe, there needs to be at least a 20 megs per second connection between them, or between those devices and the central server. Not all of them, obviously, but you can take 20 megs per second and you can have 1,000 devices on it, if that makes sense. So this is purely just to accommodate for the amount of telemetry data that will be shared with the central node and sensors as part of its, correlation, as part of its detection capabilities, so that we can really get a full sense of what's going on in our environment. Okay. Now, with that being said, you also have the opportunity of having a distributed installation with several central nodes. Now, this is different than a, let's say, active or active passive kind of scenario, because in this case, it is basically going to mean that I can host this solution as part of an MSSP, right? So managed services security provider. In a scenario like this, it means that you can have secondary central node, which is marked as SCN, that can act as local repositories, local communication points for larger offices or even customers, depending on if you're a customer of ours or if you're a partner or reseller. And they will all report back into the primary central node, which is marked as a PCN. So there's a couple of different deployment options that's available and a couple of different scenarios that we can support, just purely to be as flexible as humanly possible, right? Now, with that being said, some of the primary requirements when we talk about hardware inside of a KATA platform is going to be based off of the quantity of hosts, the amount of emails being sent per second, the amount of span traffic or mirrored traffic. This is going to give us information that's necessary to understand your RAM, your CPU, your disk usage, and then of course, based off of that, it's also going to have a direct influence in the sandbox, because with certain licenses, you have the ability to deploy more than one sandbox, for example, right? But there is absolutely no additional cost that's linked to adding additional central nodes or even adding additional sensors. That is not going to cost you a single cent more, except for the hardware, of course. But the sandbox itself does have an additional cost. Depending on the license type, you're going to either have one sandbox included, two sandboxes, or four sandboxes, but you can add more based on the requirement that you have, right? Hopefully that is clear to you, but in general, you can also get additional dedicated sensors. Now, these dedicated sensors, once again, can act as either proxies for your endpoints, can act as proxies for your email, and even for your network traffic, right? Or all of them, all of the above, but they will also have their own set of hardware requirements. Because they don't do the processing directly, their hardware requirement in general is going to be less than that of a central node, because the central node is going to receive data and process data, whereas the sensors will just pass data along, right? Which means that it's got a lower requirement from a hardware perspective, right? So at this point of the conversation, I just wanted to see, do you guys have any questions for me? Anything that I've mentioned so far that is interesting, just let me know. And yeah, I'll give you guys a minute. So I'll mute myself. Okay, so let's continue the discussion then. Right. Now, as you can see in the architecture that we have right here, we've got our central node and we've got dedicated sensors. Now, these dedicated sensors are basically going to act as the receiving points of data that's coming in from span, from mail, and from web servers or websites, or whatever the case is, from proxies. So they're going to take the brunt of the ingestion of data traffic, and that will just be passed along to our central node. Now, with that being said, as I've discussed earlier on, census is not necessarily always required, depending on the size of the organization. So that's why I'm saying that it's not just like a clear cut, if this then that. It is necessary for us to do calculation. It is necessary for us to get up to the most efficient levels that we can possibly do, right? Now, to continue that discussion even further, it's important to understand that you can have multiple sensors deployed in your environment to either focus on one set of ingestion specifically, or a combination, as we saw in the previous one. But then also please just take into account that depending on the amount of data that's being ingested, your licenses that you have will limit based on the quantity of hosts that you have. I mean, EDR hosts, based on the quantity of network traffic that you're sending on an average or a continuous basis. Based on the amount of that data, it's going to help us to understand, okay, what is your requirement, right? Now, with that being said, we also need to understand that there is going to be some margin of average amounting to how many files is going to be uploaded to the KATA sandbox or sandboxes on a continuous basis, depending on how many emails comes in, how many files are being downloaded, how many files are being shared over the network, and so on and so forth, right? So this will also increase the requirement of your KATA sandboxes, not necessarily directly, but at some point in time, it is going to become necessary to also do an evaluation to understand that requirement, right? Now, what's cool about this entire setup is you can even make it much more complicated and interesting, which is a distributed installation, where I can have a set of sandboxes that's catering for not only one central node, but it can cater for more than one, such as here, I've got a secondary central node and one primary central node. But pretty much both of them will be communicating to your sandboxes based on their availability. So they've got their own queue to accommodate for the amount of files that's being sent. And if one queue is filled up, it moves over to the next sandbox, so that we have a efficient means to be able to understand the threats, or identify the threats as soon as humanly possible, right? Now, when you run KATA in a cluster kind of mode and doing that without dedicated sensors, this is what you're going to have a look and see, right? So when we introduce the platform into a cluster mode, you're going to have storage service and you're going to have processing service, right? All of which is going to communicate to the one sandbox or sandboxes, but the bare minimum for cluster mode is to have 2 cluster storage devices and 2 cluster processing servers. Okay, so that is the bare minimum requirement to be able to run in a cluster mode. Okay. So as you can see, when we talk about the processing servers and the storage service, it becomes a little bit more complicated and interesting. Hence why exactly it is necessary to involve us in the discussion. Now, one very big benefit over a lot of our competition is that we are not bound to only one specific vendor when it comes to hardware. We give you the opportunity to go with whatever vendor partnership that you have for hardware, be it Dell or some other company, right? And you can get the best prices in that way. The only primary requirement that you need to understand is that it needs to be an Intel-based system. And if you want to do virtualization, it needs to be VMware ESXi, because that's the only one that allows for the sandbox to be able to do nested virtualization, right? So these are things that we'll talk about as we progress through the training itself, but I just wanted to mention that to you now. Now, when we talk about the sandbox, A standard or default sandbox will look something like this. If you've got it's basically going to be a 8-core with hyper-threading, that's times 2, and you've got a minimum of 80 gigs of RAM and 2 drives of 300 gigs, right? So this is a standard sandbox, but a sandbox can be increased from a hardware perspective, but generally speaking, this is the norm, and then you can just drop another additional sandbox if that is a requirement, if the queue times of the KATA sandbox falls or lags behind at the end of the day, right? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that is our pre-deployment discussions. Now, next up, we're going to start talking about the deployment and the installation and setting everything up and going through a couple of screenshots to guide you through the procedure. This is a perfect time to ask any of the questions that you might have thought of, as I've gone ahead and introduced the solution to you, talked about the pre-deployment, and then we'll start talking about the deployment itself. I'll give you guys a minute or so because I know some of the questions can sometimes be a little bit long and not everybody wants to necessarily talk. So I'll give you a minute or two. All right, so I don't see any questions, so let's proceed. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, we will of course have a lunch break. So we're just first going to finish up with the presentation. And as I've mentioned earlier this morning, that we will go through the presentation, have a lunch break, and then when you return from the lunch break, we are going to go into the actual labs, right? But yeah, that will be coming up a little bit later on. In the meantime, let's get started on the deployment. All right. So when we talk about the installation and deployment of the solution, it is important to note these two specific requirements. This is something that I actually just mentioned to you, and you'll notice that we can deploy the central node and the sensor and the sandbox, all of which on a virtual platform, right? But it's important to understand that only VMware ESXi is supported. That's for a very specific reason, right? So in this case, it allows us to do nested virtualization. And it's important to understand that for the sandbox, the only supported CPU is Intel, okay? This is once again also for that specific reason of your virtualization, okay? Now, when we look at the deployment itself, now this is looking at a cluster installation of both a storage server and a processing server, but when we talk about the deployment or the installation itself, it's a single ISO file for the central node, either in a standalone mode, a single mode, as you can see over here, or a storage node, or a computational processing node, or even in a sensor node. So basically, overall, you're going to have two ISO files. One is going to be for your central node slash sensor slash, your cluster, And the second one is going to be for the sandbox. Now, the sandbox itself has its own ISO files, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. But nonetheless, once we start with the deployment here, let me just clear that quickly. We are first going to start out with a storage server. Okay, so the storage server is going to be the first thing if we're doing a cluster installation. And we're going to select one, as it is going to be the first node of the cluster. All right. So once we progress through the installation itself, this is something of what it would look like. You would need to accept, select the language, accept the license agreement, and then we are going to specify the destination drives. We're going to confirm the installation. Now, then you need to specify the subnet for interactions between the cluster nodes. So you will notice that this is the default. Do not modify the default. It's not necessary to modify it. It shouldn't conflict with anything, but in this case, this is what will be used. All right, so this is to allow the servers to communicate with one another, your two storage servers and your two processing servers. Okay, so you need to then go ahead and select the external and internal interfaces. So when you run a cluster, you're going to have one that is receiving from the rest of the environment, and you've got one that is responsible for inter-cluster communication effectively, right? So we're going to follow the static IP addressing, or you can configure it using DHCP. I found it personally to be more favorable to use static IPs. You're going to specify the password for the admin account. Now, please bear in mind that when we say the admin account, you're going to get a difference between an SSH account or a local CLI account, and you're going to also get a separate account, which is your administrator account for your web server side, right? So when you visit the actual application on its web server, okay. Then you need to specify the DNS and NTP servers. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot stress this enough. If there is a mismatch in time from one server to the next, or from your central node to the sandbox, regardless of if it is in a cluster or not, you are going to receive errors that won't be diagnosable. So always the first thing to make sure is you've got an NTP server that is set up so that your time is synchronized amongst all of your servers, right? Then you're going to select the disks for your storage, and you're going to confirm the installation. All right. Then the second stage of this is going to be to install your processing servers. Okay. So then you're going to install a computation node, which is option number 2. Similar process, as you can see, licensing agreements, selecting destination drives, confirming installation, the same subnet setup, and you can see here once again the default. All right. Now, installing the processing server, we are going to once again specify the IP addresses. However, with a processing server, if you are going to do ingestion of span traffic or mirror traffic, we need to set additional network interface card, and this network interface card is dedicated to your capture port, right? So a capture port is basically a network interface card that is literally just configured with the hardline connection to your central your central network switches, and it's going to receive a duplication of traffic. Now, if you are going to run a cluster without a dedicated, let's say, sensor, then in that case, you are going to need to go and set this up on your central nodes or your processing service. So after that is all done and well, you should be able to access your web dashboard effectively on the same address, just as long as you've got the right port selected, right? Port 8443 is the default. The account is that admin account, and you need to make sure that you sign in as a local administrator. Now, this may be confusing to some of you, but you get different accounts that has different rights and different access into the web dashboard. So for example, a local administrator account has access into the server's configuration, the server's health, and to a variety of different other settings, basically completion of deployment and these kinds of things. So that's the local administrator account. But then you also get other accounts that's responsible just for, threat management and threat investigation and incident investigation, right? But for this specific scenario, we are going to have a look at our cluster, and we need to make sure that all of our cluster nodes are communicating with one another. So here we can see our two storage and two processing nodes, right? You can see their usage and utilization. Great stuff. Now we need to configure this as part of our discussion. So how many endpoints are we going to handle approximately? What is the amount of mail traffic per second? What is the span traffic that we're going to be ingesting? All right. So based off of that, we're going to see an approximation of how the data retention will be and how the event databases we need, how big of space we need for event databases, depending on this, right? So here we can go and modify that. And then we're going to say configure. So it's going to modify your cluster according to your configuration here. As part of cluster management though, now we're going to sign in with the local administrator account, which will give us access into the rest of the configuration of the system itself. Our cluster is now configured, so to say, right? So now we can go ahead and we can configure the actual platform itself. So what operation mode? Is it distributed mode? Is it cluster mode? Is it going to be standalone mode? We can modify the settings such as your time, your language. We can set up notifications and these kinds of things. We can integrate our sensor servers and third-party API integration platforms, sandbox servers, and the likes, right? But before we go into those configurations, let's first install a sensor. So this is a dedicated sensor. Now, by installing a dedicated sensor, we're going to use the exact same ISO file we used for the central node. So in this case, we're just going to select option number 4, which is the sensor node. Now you'll notice once we've selected that, it's a much simpler configuration. Once again, privacy policies, license agreements. We're going to specify destination drives, subnet of communication if there's a cluster available. We're going to set up our sensor network. Once again, if your sensor is going to act as a dedicated ingestion point for span traffic or mirror port traffic, we need to have an additional dedicated network interface card to do the capturing of that traffic. We're going to set up either DHCP or static IP. We're going to create its own admin account. Bear in mind that if you install a sensor, it's not going to have a web dashboard such as the central node or the sandbox. It is only going to be managed by SSH, or configuration changes can be made to some extent in the central node itself. Okay. So as part of the sensor's installation, once again, we need to specify the DNS and make sure that we have an NTP server that aligns the time across the entire deployment. Right. So now we've got our cluster deployed, our two storage servers, our two processing servers, as well as a sensor, which can act as a dedicated sensor for us to, alleviate some of the ingestion that is going to be necessary on the cluster itself. Any questions up to this point before we start talking about the sandbox? Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, as we've mentioned already, the sandbox is going to be its own dedicated server, right? This can either be physical or virtual. Please bear in mind, though, that if we're going to do it virtually, it's going to be on VMware ESXi, and there's going to be some configuration required on the ESXi platform. All right. Now, in this specific state, we need to make sure that if we're going to virtualize our sandbox, we are going to have a slight increase in its prerequisite hardware, right? Because this is through a virtual platform, it's going to increase just slightly. But with that being said, we need to enable nested virtualization on the hypervisor because the sandbox is going to spin up its own virtual machines, right? We need to make sure that we reserve the entire CPU resource pool to it, reserve all of the RAM, and we need to select high for the latency sensitivity. All right, so that is the pre-configuration that we need to do on the hypervisor itself. And then we can start by deploying the ISO image. All right, and the sandbox installation is pretty straightforward if you're just doing it off of the ISO. You go ahead and you go through the licensing agreements, specify a host name, specify a disk that will be responsible for housing all of the virtual machines. And then you are going to have 2 network interface cards. That is a hard prerequisite for the sandbox. The main reason you've got a management interface and you've got an internet interface. The internet interface is also known as the malware interface. Here's why. The management interface is for managing the server and integrating it into your central node or central nodes, right? But the internet or malware interface is supposed to be a segregated network. A new or different network, even better. But you can do this with DMZ, you can do this with VLANs and so on. But generally speaking, the internet or malware interface is used for detonation of malware, unrestricted, untapped internet communication for whatever threat it is that we are detonating as part of the sandbox. Because we need to understand what that threat is going to do. We need to understand where it's communicating. And we can't do that if it's being limited the whole time. But we also do not want to have that it can break up into the rest of your internal infrastructure, the corporate network. Okay. So in that regard, we need a dedicated or segregated network for the malware or internet interface that has the ability of obviously analyzing the objects that's being connected. Okay. So with that being said, we're going to, once again, add DNS. We're going to add NTP to all of this, right? And as part of the sandbox installation, we need to set up our static routes to ensure that it's communicating and we can communicate to it, right? Then we are going to set up a username and a password. Now, what's cool about this is it's one account that will be used for both SSH as well as for your web console. So it's the same account, same credentials. Then once that process is done, we should be able to access, if your static routes are working correctly, you should be able to just go to its IP address, HTTPS with port 8443. So you can see the central node, your cluster, and the sandbox all has the same port usage by default. Okay, but obviously it will be a different IP address, so that's perfectly fine. Once we logged in, this is where we continue with the installation. So we need to ensure that time is synchronized. This is typically where you will add NTP in your sandbox, is on the web console, whereas on the central node, we usually do it as part of the installation process itself, right? So we need to make sure that it synchronizes the time across all of them, and we use the same NTP server or servers for the entire deployment. Then we need to set up our secondary network interface card, which is our internet interface or malware interface, right? So you'll notice that it has the internet interface area here, and it will typically be something completely different, hopefully, than the first or management interface. And this is what will be used primarily by your virtual machines to actually communicate out to the internet if there's any detonation that's taking place on the sandbox. The second part of the sandbox, because at this point of the time, this point in time, we only have the framework of the sandbox, but we do not have any of the inner workings just yet. The inner workings is where we add the virtual machines. So ladies and gentlemen, we provide then a whole list of different ISO files as part of the pre-configured, pre-customized, and pre-activated operating systems that's to be used by the sandbox. For example, Windows XP, 7, 10, Azure Linux, and CentOS. All right. Now, something that's interesting that is not mentioned in this particular version of the training is that with version 5.1, there's also the opportunity and the ability to completely import a customized ISO, a customized virtual machine. Now, this is in an effort to create a environment, a sandboxed environment that is much closer to that of your internal environment, meaning your domain is joined, your naming convention for the host name, your activations for Windows and for Office and these kinds of things. And of course, the installations of third-party applications that is to be used and that is generally used inside of your organization. This will help with anti-evasion for more complex malware, right? Now, as a standard sandbox, if it is physical, it will have the ability of spinning up 48 parallel virtual machines to obviously run through the queue of submitted files. But if this sandbox with the same hardware is assigned in a hypervisor, that's going to reduce to 12, right? So as you can see, there's a slight increase in hardware utilization if a sandbox is being virtualized. Okay. Any questions up to this point, ladies and gentlemen? Right, so let's proceed. Now, oh, wait. Oh, yeah, okay. No questions. Okay, so next up is we've got our servers up and running, but nothing has been activated yet. No users have been added, no updates have been done, and they've definitely not been integrated into one another just yet. So let's start with that. When we talk about the solution as a whole, nothing will work if it is not licensed. So I cannot, do any threat hunting. I cannot do anything if I do not have a license. Now, there's two separate licenses that will respectively activate KATA and EDR. So, for example, the KATA license will activate your updates, KSN, and the receiving and processing of data on network traffic. All right, great stuff. But EDR is going to then add the receiving and processing of telemetry from endpoints and the response capabilities. So threat hunting, response task, execution prevention, and storage. Right. So you need both of these licenses if you're going to do a full KATA platform, and it's two separate licenses as I've just mentioned. But you can get from a sales perspective, there's the bundled licensing, which pretty much activates both. But from a technical perspective, it will still be separated, even though it's one single license. Right, now to activate your central node, as you can see, these are the two entry points, KATA and EDR. We are going to be signed in as the local administrator account. As I've mentioned to you, the local administrative account is purely for the administration and maintenance of the platform itself. It doesn't have the capability of seeing any incidents, any alerts, or investigating or anything like that. It's purely for the maintenance of your platform. So we're going to activate it with the .key files that will be provided as part of the deployment. And generally speaking, this implementation from start to finish will be handled by Kaspersky. That's the way that we like to do it, just to make sure that there's no issues. But nonetheless, once we have that up and running, we're going to configure the updates. So from a central node perspective, we need to communicate to Kaspersky Lab, and it updates every 30 minutes now. This, once again, is going to bring us new information about signatures. It's going to bring us new information about behavioral patterns. It's going to bring us new information about the micro attack matrix. It's also going to bring in information about a variety of different other aspects. All right. So then you get different user roles as part of the central node. So I've mentioned to you the local administrator account. And this is where we've got the capability of, configuring everything, managing distributed modes, sensor traffic, and so on and so forth, right? But then you also get things like senior security officer and security officer. Now these two, this is the senior account, and this is the junior account, if you will. The senior account has access into everything, except for things that the administrator has access to. Then you will also have access into the VIP alerts. So your very important IP addresses, email addresses, these kinds of things. They will have access into those specific alerts. But then the security officer account has access into threat information, but no access into VIP information. They do not have access to the response tool, threat hunting, and these kinds of things. But they only have access into alerts and telemetry and alert processing, right? So that's the typical hierarchy. But then you also have a third account called auditor. So auditor can read access to all information, but no configuration, no threat hunting, no creation of responses or anything like this. This is purely just a viewing role, a viewing account as part of everything. Okay. So we can then go in, and as a logged in local administrator, we go and create our users, because by default, there is no senior security officer. These accounts need to be created. Okay. So we're going to base it either off of a local account, such as KATA user account, or we can base it off of a domain user account. Now, if you're going to do domain user account, we need to first set up our authentication via Active Directory. This is where you're going to introduce your key tab file. You're going to specify the details, such as what you can see on screen. And we do have quite a lot of guides on how you can go about doing this, right? But then what's cool about this is we can just search for a username, search for users, part of our domain, and they will then be able to access in without us needing to create specific user accounts as part of an internal system as part of the KATA platform. All right. So with the benefits of the domain account is that we can obviously set up our direct integration and login into the platform, right? We just do a little bit of a configuration, take the certificate into account and add them to the trusted zones. And then from there, we will be able to easily log in with our domain accounts. Okay. Any questions up to this point, ladies and gentlemen, before we talk about integrating the service into one another? Okay, so next up is we've got our service up and running. We've got some users created as part of our central node. Now we need to interconnect all of these servers, integrate them to one another so that they speak to each other and obviously contribute to the overall picture. So the first step is we are going to integrate our sandbox, right? Now on the KATA platform, as you can see over here, this is our central node basically that we logged into as our local administrator. We go to the sandbox server area. From there, we're going to select on add. And then from here, we're going to specify the IP address and we're going to get the certificate fingerprint and give it a name, right? So we just select SB, for example, and we click on add. Now, that will result in a request being sent to the sandbox that will appear over here. All right, so we need to log in back into our sandbox, and you can obviously be logged into both at the same time. Right, go to KATA authorization, and then you will see that there is going to be a request coming in. So it's important to verify and validate that the fingerprints match. So obviously I don't have to go through the entire thing, but at least check the first 4 or 5 and the last 4 or 5, and then somewhere in the middle. And then on the sandboxing side, we can click on accept. So once we've clicked on accept, it means that our sandbox is now integrated into our central node. Then what we can actually go ahead and do is, if we don't want to have our sandbox and our central node downloading updates independent of one another, we can actually use the central node as our main repository for updates. So to do this, we're going to go into its database update section, select a custom server, and you will notice that it has this hyperlink of the IP address of the central node. Once you click on that, it will enter this information that you see here. So the IP address and retranslation. So this means that if the central node updates, it is also going to be able to share those updates with your sandboxing server. Right. So from here, to finish up with the sandboxing side, it's important or not finish up, but to select on your central node what virtual machines are going to be used as part of your sandbox. You can go ahead and you can select them. Now, obviously, this will be different for every organization, because not all organizations are going to have things like Astra Linux distributions in their environment or CentOS distributions in their environment. Perhaps they only have Windows XP, Windows 7, and Windows 10. Now, obviously, Windows 10 is the same architecture as Windows 11. Windows 7 is the same as Windows 8. Actually, Windows 10 is basically the same as 8 and 11, but nonetheless, you get the point, right? So you can select the bunch of virtual machines that will be used by that particular sandbox server. All right. Okay, now, for a sensor to be integrated into your central node, you are obviously not going to be able to select it from a web console, because a sensor does not have a web console. So you will need to SSH or use the local CLI of that sensor server that you've deployed. And you will see that by the role that is mentioned at the top there after you've logged in. Right, so it will say sensor only. Then we're going to say configure central node. And then once again, punch in the details. And on the sensor side, you're sending the request to the central node. Equally on the central node, you're going to see then the sensor service area. And from here, you need to authorize after confirming the fingerprints, the certificates, right? Okay. So then if you are planning on running in a distributed mode, right? A distributed mode allows us to have a primary central node and a secondary central node, a PCN and a SCN. This is where you have the ability to set up tenant names. So this can be company names, it can be operating unit names, it can be geographical names, whatever your choice is. But the purpose of this is allowing the capability of setting up different divisions of central nodes that will act as local repositories across your entire large-scale network, right? So for example, I can then stop using the solution in a standalone mode, switch over to distributed mode, and from there I can then set up tenants. I can set up unique accounts for each tenant, but all of which will be able to communicate back to the primary central node, right? So from here, you can add your companies, or even if you don't have different companies, you can just say, maybe this is my Dubai office or my South Africa office, or whatever the case is, right? You get the point. But nonetheless, you set up your tenants or company names, and then you assign which secondary central nodes are going to be responsible for any of those companies, okay? So to add secondary central nodes to this entire operation, you are going to, once again, similar to the sensor and similar to the sandbox, we are going to set up your secondary central nodes. So what you're going to do is once you've set up more than one central node, only one of them are going to be switched over to distributed solution and going to act as a primary. For the secondary ones, we're going to send those requests because we're just going to select it as secondary central nodes. So that connection request is coming from my secondary, and we can then approve it on our primary, right? Once you have that, it gives us the opportunity then to tell them, which tenant it is supposed to serve. So from here, we can say, okay, I'm going to accept the connection and you're going to serve this tenant or this company or this department or whatever the case is. All right. And when we talk about, further configurations that we've done on the primary central node, the secondary central node is going to receive its user lists from the primary node. It's also going to be activated by the primary central node. And that's the same and the truth for the sensor and for the sandbox. So your central node is responsible then for the activation of the rest of your platform. Okay. But what's cool about this entire operation is I can have different administrators, different security officers that's focusing in on different companies or different tenants or whatever you want to use in that facet. So I can either have an account that has super admin privilege, which means that it has access into everything, or only for specific tenants as part of the entire operation. As you can see, the licenses are going to then be synchronized with the central node of the primary central node. Okay. Any questions here, ladies and gentlemen? All right, ladies and gentlemen, now going into the final area of the presentation for today, which is the first day of our discussions, obviously. This is going to talk about the endpoint agent installation and the connection of your EDR components into your central node setup. Now, it's important for me to emphasize once again that endpoint agents are no longer being used with the current version of the solution. So the version of training that we're dealing with right now is version 5.0, but the version of the solution that's available right now is 5.1. And with that change, it also changed the way that it operates with the endpoint agent. There is no such thing as an endpoint agent any longer. We are going to make use of the embedded capability that's part of Kaspersky Endpoint Security. All right. Now, later on in this year, which is just a little bit of extra information, we're also going to release our endpoint security to be installed as either a full agent or just the EDR integration capabilities, which opens up the door for more flexible deployments into more diverse infrastructures. Okay, but nonetheless, I'm still going to just highlight some of the points as part of this section because it's still relevant to the discussion. But I'll tell you exactly where and what it is that you need to remember. Okay. Now, the first thing that you need to know is that the Kaspersky Security Center, for those of you that's familiar, is used on our Kaspersky Endpoint Security for Business. This is its main management console, and this is pretty much where it's going to be managed. This is where it's going to be hosted. this is where everything basically takes place, and it gives us the opportunity of doing remote deployments, which is crucial for this particular discussion. Right. Now, the central node itself does not mimic the Kaspersky Security Center. It's two separate entities. It's two separate ways of working. Right. But we can still use the Kaspersky Security Center to help us in the overall deployment of the EDR agent side. Okay. So we can either do it with the Kaspersky Security Center, which is a much quicker and easier setup, or without. Now you can do the without, and this will generally be done using MSI packages and GPO for your Active Directory, or locally using an MSI package and the installation wizard. Right now, you can also do this using the command line, which was the initial way that it used to work with when EDR Expert just came out a couple of years ago. Okay. Now, it's important once again that some of this content is not relevant because we no longer use the endpoint agent, right? So this is irrelevant. For example, this is going to be irrelevant. So I'll just stop at the point where I know that we are ready to go. Okay. Now, this is kind of relevant. This is remote deployment using the packages, but in this case, assuming that your organization already has the Kaspersky Endpoint Security installed, the only thing that we're going to be required to do is going to do a change application components task rather than do a full deployment, because the capability in the latest versions of the endpoint security is already there, it just needs to be activated. Okay, so as simple as that. But we can also do local installations, but once again, that's relevant only to Kaspersky Endpoint Security for Business and not to the endpoint agent. Okay, now let me just quickly check here. This is going to be useful for you. So obviously your Kaspersky Endpoint Security, so it used to work a little bit different, such as displayed on screen, but this is very relevant to the current discussion of the current versions of software. Kaspersky Endpoint Security for Windows, you're going to modify the installation package to also include the integration into the KATA platform. And you're also going to then modify the policy, right? So the policy of Kaspersky Endpoint Security is also then going to have that capability. All right. Now, how it works is basically it's going to use a handshake, basically certificate information between your Kaspersky Security Center that's going to share the insight into your endpoints, and your endpoints then inevitably communicating either to sensors, if that's how you set it up, or directly to the central node. Now, this is only possible if you've got the right certificate information, and this certificate information will be added as part of your Kaspersky Endpoint Security for Business policy. Okay, now the certificates that I'm referring to is, for example, this certificate here, which is the service certificate of the KATA platform, right? Which you can just go and quickly export and generate if you don't have one. This is part of a local admin sign in on your web console of the central node. Then you're going to input that certificate information as part of the policy of your endpoint security so that it has the right certificate information, right? But there's additional authentication that takes place, which is another certificate, and this certificate can be collected right below the one that we just collected. So we just collected this one first. The second one is the endpoint certificate. Okay, this endpoint certificate needs to be generated. Once it's generated, that will then once again be added to the rest of the policy, which you can see over here, that will be inside of your endpoint security. Okay, so once you've added the certificate information, you can confirm the connection, configure the connection, and specify policies manually as well using the agent.exe, basically using it with PowerShell or command prompt or whatever the case is. But you can also check the agent connection settings. So check if the agent is communicating, how much data has it shared, is it activated, and these kinds of things, right? So you can do this locally on the devices, or you can go ahead and just have a look on the central node itself. So on the central node side of things, this is what it should look like, right? So you're going to see that you have got endpoint agents still logged in as a local administrator. The devices themselves will start popping up, populating effectively, and they should say normal activity, right? It also should say that it's been licensed. So you need to make sure of that. Now, to test and confirm the data that's being captured on these devices, because remember, this is endpoint telemetry data, we can go to the threat hunting side logged in as a senior security officer, and we can literally just punch in the IP address of these devices, right? Or the host name of these devices. And if we go into either one of them, it should show us a whole list of data, events, and information that's being shared by either the operating system, third-party apps, or whatever the case is. Now, if you've got a scenario such as this, where you've got critical inactivity, this is typically going to mean that it hasn't sent telemetry data in quite some time. So in this case, you need to go and investigate and see, is this person perhaps offline? Are they on holiday or leave or whatever the case is? And validate and verify what is going on. Now, the statistics on the endpoint side will be sent very frequently, and it will also be cached. But there is a rate limiter that's built in so that we do not have a massive influx. If certain devices, once they are being hacked or some form of malware is running on them, there could be a massive increase in communication and events generated. So only the important things are going to be added, but repetitive stuff of the same sort, same kind is not going to be added. And this is to ensure that we obviously do not hit a rate limit. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, do you guys have any questions at this time? These will be the last questions for today. So if you've got any questions on anything that we have presented to you as part of the presentation today, now is your time to ask. Obviously, after this is done, we're going to have a lunch break, and then we're going to do the labs, the hands-on part of the training for the remainder of the afternoon. This is where you yourself are going to actually deploy the solution, configure it, test it, and so on. And yeah, of course, tomorrow we're going to talk about more of the technology or the components that's inside of the solution rather than just the deployment and implementation. Okay, any questions? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to now have our 1 hour lunch break. So we will have lunch break until 10 minutes past 2 GMT plus 4, that's Gulf Standard Time, and GMT plus 2, that will be your 10 past 12 in the afternoon, I guess. So yeah, we will have lunch break, and when you return, I will have shared with you a number of details in the GoToWebinar application. But yeah, please enjoy your little break, and then when you return at that time, we will continue further. All right, thank you.